It's time for Straight Talk Live with renowned radio pioneer Edna Howell-Parrish, the television show and podcast dedicated to presenting thought-provoking issues and opinions with the goal of challenging listeners to re-examine their assumptions and expand their opinions and give thought to new ideas and concepts to better their lives and the lives of others. This is your opportunity to participate in making the world better. So without further ado, let's get ready for Straight Talk Live with your host Edna Howell-Parrish.
And welcome to the show today. I'm Edna Howell-Parrish. Our guest today is Dr. John H. McClendon III. He is a professor at the Department of Philosophy at Michigan State University. His areas of interest include African American philosophers and philosophical traditions, African philosophy, Marxism, philosophy of sports, and the African American experience, as well as philosophy of religion and African Americans. Good day, John, and welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to the day.
Well, Dr. John is the author of numerous books. And as you can tell by the show today, our lineup includes those areas that he really loves to talk about. When we talk about Ghana and its independence and the celebration coming up, John, that's one of your favorites, I know.
Oh, yes, definitely.
When we talk about the issue of what's going on in Africa, period. South Africa, in fact, with Donald Trump offering South Africans asylum in America. Was he surprised when he found out what the South Africans said, I wonder?
Well, there's a very important link in his administration because Elon Musk, is South African. Also, a number of the people who started what is known as PayPal were South Africans, of which Musk is one of that group. So there is a close link to South Africa, and there is a conception about race and white supremacy to play a key role in Trump's conception of what should be the nature of the state and the notion of what is a nation state here in the United States.
Our show today will also include a discussion about colorism. Colorism, well, we got melanin in our skin, but some people don't have a lot of melanin and by way of their parents. So some of them look colored as we are, and then some of them look white, and some of them pass for white. And in our history of our nation, we have a lot of people that was in that category.
Precisely. And of course, for some, they saw that as a way of avoiding the kind of oppressive conditions that came by just way of one's phenotype, how you appeared to be Black. On the other hand, there were others who decided to stay and identify despite their phenotypic appearances. So we have many who pass, but we also have many who, as Dr. Rayford Logan would call, honorary Negroes.
Honorary Negroes. Well, let's talk with that because that's interesting. Who in the category would some of the honorary Negroes be, John?
Well, among those would be Richard T. Greener, whose wife and daughter went on to pass as white. We would also have Walter White, who ironically, not only his name, but his phenotype gave him the opportunity to actually observe lynchings and report on lynchings, who served as the head of the NAACP. And then we have people like Mordecai Johnson, who was the president of Harvard University. And then you have John Hope, who was the president of Atlanta University when Dr. Du Bois was there. So there's always been that important group who identified. More recently, the attorney, legal professor Gregory Williams, who was the dean of the law school at The Ohio State University and later the president of the University of Cincinnati, was also one of those people. But he discovered he was white at the age of 10. But after discovering that, he embraced it. And I met him, and it was really interesting because when I looked at him, I couldn't tell that he was uh, in any way had African descent, but he gave you the handshake. And I knew then that he was involved, in terms of African American culture. But when we talk
Okay,
about
I can't
races,
do the handshake, but you mean the handshake.
yeah, the handshake,
You mean
yes.
the handshake.
Yeah, that the brothers do. And he gave me that. And I said, okay. He
Oh
let me
yeah.
know he was in the culture.
Okay. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to put his picture up and let you talk about Gregory Howard Williams, who was born in Indiana, and he was discovered that he was African American when he was 10. Let's talk about him and how did that discovery come about?
Sure. That came about when he and his father, and he didn't know, but his grandmother were all living as wealthy, rather wealthy white people. His father owned a business, and because of his somewhat swarthy complexion, of course, we know that there are many who come from the Mediterranean, Greek and Italians, who have a darker complexion than what you would find in the more Nordic end of the European groupings that are classified as white. And then after the failure of that business, the family had to move back to Muncie, Indiana. And that meant not only moving back to Muncie, but reclaiming their African American identity and living in the Black community at Muncie. And so that was a real shock to him because he had no clue until his father sprung the word on him that, son, you're not white, but you're Black. You're not wealthy, but you're poor. And we're going to move back to Indiana. And the last thing is that the lady who you thought was your servant all these years, who lived in our home, that's your grandmother. And when that was found out that he was not white, his Gregory Williams' mother divorced his father and left because she was a white woman who always thought that her husband was white. And she indicated she did not want to have any association with Black children. And so his mother moved away, and then they returned to Muncie. However, he was very ambitious in terms of his education, received a number of not only the undergraduate degree from Ball State, which is in Muncie, Indiana, but he also had a number of graduate degrees, including a law degree and a PhD.
All right, Gregory Howard Williams. So his privilege was there because his mother pushed, and she didn't want association with anybody Black.
That's right.
But he
Little
did well
known
for
to
him. He
say
did
that she
well for
had a Black
himself
kid.
now. I
Beg your
wonder how
pardon?
he felt. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I said, and the idea that she would have a Black kid was, she saw that as humiliating. And so she abandoned the family.
So I wonder how it was that he did identify as Black. How much later on after his mom died or what?
Well, it was at the age of 10 when his father found out that his business fell through. His network that he has established as a wealthy business person, evaporated. So he had no other recourse but to return back to the Black community in Muncie, Indiana. And so his son had no clue about that until that happened. So it was out of that situation where he went from a wealthy white man to a poor Black man that he had to disclose that. And the grandmother, of course, was quite bitter because she had to play this role of a house servant when in fact that was the grandmother because she was darker in complexion. And so they kept her along as a house servant. So she was also hostile. So Gregory Williams grew up in a very fractured home and suffered considerably. His father became an alcoholic. There was a lot of stress that he went through as a result of that. So it's a remarkable story. He appeared on many programs, including the Oprah Winfrey program, when he came out with his autobiography. And but he was a fascinating person to talk to in terms of how he overcame those things and how he made a concerted effort to serve as an honorary Negro, as Dr. Logan would say.
His book entitled Life on the Color Line, the true story of a white boy who discovered he was Black. So that's very interesting reading, although it's old, but it's still important to know that information. And under his leadership at University of Cincinnati, when he was president, the enrollment reached a historic level. And then the history of the university, they established a new health system. And in 2012, he resigned from that position of president, citing personal reasons. So I don't know why he left, but he made his impression, his mark at UC for sure.
Yes, no doubt. He also served as the president in the City University of New York system, in the Cooney system as well. And so, and he was recognized by the Black Lawyers Association, called the National Bar Association. There are two professional groups. There's the so-called American Bar Association, and then there's the National Bar Association. Because of the segregation in law practices, they started what was called the National Bar Association, which ironically, one of the earliest members of the National Bar Association was Richard T. Greener, whose daughter, as Belle Green, passed as white.
Excellent. I want you to talk about her. I'm going to show her picture. Let's show Richard Greener's picture. He being African American, but then his wife was white. Understand?
No. His wife his wife was African American. She came from an elite Black family, and so when she married Richard T. Greener, he was a quite progressive, outspoken Black leader. In those days, they would refer to them as a race man. And so she didn't like that. She wanted to live a comfortable life. So she and the daughter, Belle, changed her name from Greener to Green with an E at the end, and went on with their lives as white people.
Okay, so I'm going to show Richard Greener's picture first, the father, and then I'll show Bella DaCosta Green after that. Okay. Now, John, as we were talking here this afternoon, first I showed the wrong picture, but then I got it back later. I got the right one for Richard T. Greener on, and then his daughter, Belle DaCosta. Now, again, let's talk about who Richard Greener was, and then how his daughter entered the picture, and what made her so famous.
Sure. Richard T. Greener was the first Black graduate of Harvard. Very outstanding student there. And then he went on to become the first Black faculty member at the University of South Carolina. What was unique about the experience at the University of South Carolina, which it was historically white, but became predominantly Black during Reconstruction. South Carolina had one of the highest concentration in terms of former slaves who then came to the University of South Carolina, and it led to white flight. So the white students left, and it became a predominantly Black institution, but they still had all-white faculty until Richard T. Greener got there. He assumed several positions there, including librarian, and also he was a professor of philosophy, of which then he educated a number of young people in the field of philosophy. Also, at the same time, he went to law school at the University of South Carolina and gained his law degree. Now, how he did all those things simultaneously shows remarkably not only his capacity as an intellect, but also the energy that he had. And so when Reconstruction was overturned in South Carolina, he left and became the dean of the law school at Howard University. In the meantime, he became one of the most outspoken persons in terms of Black leadership in the postbellum period and through the early 20th century. He belonged to a number of groups, including not only the National Bar Association, but the American Negro Academy, which was founded in 1897. And he became a very important part of what Du Bois called the talented tenth. He was also a diplomat for the federal government, and he served at Vladivostok, which is a part of what was formerly the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire. And so he was a very distinguished Black leader. And one piece that he wrote that is of value in terms of scholarship, in terms of philosophical thinking, is a piece that he wrote called The White Problem, where he says they talk in terms of a Negro problem, but the problem is not with Black people. The problem is with white racism and white supremacy. Bell, on the other hand, didn't want anything to do with this legacy that her father had created, and she and her mother then passed for white, and she worked for a considerable number of years at very prestigious Ivy League schools. Ironically, as I said, her father being a graduate of Harvard, she worked both at Columbia and at Princeton University. During that time, she was discovered by an aide of the as they called them in those days, the robber barons, J.P. Morgan. And J.P. Morgan at that time had the largest private library in the world. And he wanted someone who could work as his librarian to collect valuable books and manuscripts, as well as artwork. And so she was selected to be that person. And over the years, she helped him expand his private library with the idea of trying to develop it so there would be accessibility to the public. And so in that capacity, she traveled throughout Europe and in fact, throughout the world. She constantly went to places like Rome and Greece to get artwork and rare books. And she continued on after J.P. Morgan died to run his library. And she lived until 1950, where she died of cancer. But she was noted as a distinguished lady who continued on to hobnob with some of the elite white people in the country.
A white woman, so-called white woman of society. She was all of that and more.
Yes.
You know, the whole issue of colorism continues to impact us here in America even today. We see why the president now, current president, is stopping all issues of race equality among people of any kind of descent, whether you're African American, you're anybody that is your sexual orientation, just cutting all that out. And I think that he knows that race divides. It divides us, whether we're lighter or darker, but he knows they put that emphasis on the color and it causes us to just disintegrate. Even with Hispanics and other minorities of color, it's going to cause all of us to just not even be together, pull away from each other. And he knows that. A lot of people can't understand why did disband Martin Luther King Day? Why did disband anything in Hispanic Day?
Yeah, and what we have to understand, there is a master narrative behind thinking regarding what we know as U.S. history. And just briefly, I'll just lay out two of those layers. There's more layered than that, but the narrative is this. First, the idea is that African American history is United States history. That's the first layer. The second layer is that the United States is a nation state. And the idea of the two, African American history is United States history. The United States is a nation state that, from the conservative standpoint, then, nationalism and race identity has to be established on the supremacy of white rule and white dominance, because that's how this country started. It started on the idea that you could enslave Africans and you could take the land and slaughter and commit genocide against the indigenous population. So from the standpoint of Trump, who said that the president he most admired was, in fact, Andrew Jackson, who was a slaveholder and a racist, and also the person who was behind what was called the Indian Removal Act and served as the progenitor of what became the Trail of Tears that forced indigenous people to move westward. That's the tradition. So in many ways, he's not an aberration in terms of the history of the United States, and rather he's very consistent with a viewpoint. And this is why I say the narrative is that African American history is United States history. And if that's the case, what he's emphasizing is that any emphasis on something like Black History Month or any kind of ethnic identity is divisive. And this division, this divisiveness that comes in looking at race as primary over national identity is what he says he is trying to implement. Because at the other end of the idea that the United States is a nation is a very important caveat, namely that the United States is a nation state whose origins rest in Europe. And once you say that, then that means the preeminence of people of European descent. And of course, for Donald Trump, his father was a Nazi. Andrew Jackson, other slaveholders of the people that he held up high, and then people that he worked with, like Elon Musk, for example, is from South Africa. And the whole group that started PayPal, they were from South Africa. So now his interest is to promote then bringing in South Africans. And he uses as a justification the fact that currently South Africa is redistributing the land in South Africa so it becomes more equitable regarding the Black population. Under apartheid, 15% of the community, that is the white settlers, who were 15% of the population, controlled 85% of the land. And that has continued, this disparity has continued right up to today. So now there is a program to redistribute the land, and Donald Trump is incensed by this. And so what he's offering then to white South Africans is that they could come to the United States. So that's what's behind this venture that he's taking.
Were you surprised to hear that at all?
Oh, no. No. Remember, like I said, his father was a Nazi. Elon Musk is a South African. Many of the people who are surrounding him, and remember the United States policy towards South Africa until very late in the ballgame was pro-apartheid. So we have to remember that the United States invested tremendous amounts of money into South Africa to prop up this system of apartheid and racist oppression against our brothers and sisters in South Africa. So this is nothing new. This is a part of how Trump sees the world, and a number of people in this country see the world. And so he's saying, come on and join us because we're going to get white supremacy back in track,
No,
and
my
you
question was
don't
going
have
to
to go
be,
through that in South Africa.
okay. So do you think that the South Africans were surprised to hear Donald Trump's offer for them to, come to America to get away from the oppressiveness of South Africans for them? These are the white people, not the black ones. He wasn't inviting them, but the white ones.
I think
Were they surprised?
the white people in South Africa were not surprised because they understood Trump's position from day one. You have to understand that South Africa was the first country to speak out on behalf of the Palestinians. When resolutions were being passed in the United Nations condemning what was going on in terms of Zionism and Israel regarding the Palestinians, the first country to speak out on behalf of the Palestinians were South Africans. They understood full well what apartheid is, and they recognized that what was going on in Palestine and what was happening to the Palestinians was very much the same experience and legacy that they faced under apartheid. So South Africa openly spoke against the United States policy regarding Palestine and its support of Zionism. So they were on a collision course from the very beginning. Then South Africa was then incorporated into a very important international economic movement called BRICS. And BRICS represents then an alternative to the world capitalist system of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. And the United States is hostile to that idea. But in that notion of BRICS, the S represents South Africa, the C represents China, the R represents Russia. So you can see then that in this move towards BRICS, and what South Africa is doing is at loggerheads with U.S. international policy as well as U.S. domestic policy. And so Trump wants to say, basically, let's get this together and we'll offer you a place to come if you are, being, quote, facing racism again by the majority people in South Africa.
Now, the white South Africans have responded to Trump's offer to give them refuge in America. And then Trump signed an executive order to cut U.S. aid to South America.
U.S. President Donald Trump's offer to take in white South Africans as refugees fleeing persecution may not spur quite the rush he anticipated. An executive order he signed on Friday provided for resettlement in the U.S. of, quote, Afrikaners in South Africa who are victims of unjust racial discrimination as refugees. Afrikaners are mostly white South African descendants of Dutch and French settlers, some tracing back their roots in the country to the 17th century. But it's not clear they want to flee the place they've called home for hundreds of years.
Why would you want to go? Hasn't been any really bad taking over of land. The people are carrying on like normal. And, what are you going to do over there?
That was the response from Neville van der Merwe, a white 78-year-old pensioner living in Cape Town. And he had this to say about Trump cutting off aid to his country.
We all know how Mr. Trump behaves, so why should they do that? It is being spiteful.
Trump is pushing back against a law signed last month by President Cyril Ramaphosa, aimed at addressing the country's unequal land ownership. White South Africans make up less than a tenth of the country's population, but a legacy of the racist apartheid government left 3/4 of privately owned land in the hands of the white minority, after 3.5 million black people were forced from their homes. The new law makes it easier for the state to expropriate land for what it says is the public interest.
And we will not be bullied.
Ramaphosa's governing African National Congress, or ANC, has defended the measure and accused Trump of amplifying misinformation propagated by AfriForum, an Afrikaner-led group. And even that group, which lobbied Trump's previous administration on their cause, said it was not taking up his offer.
We have to state categorically, we don't want to move elsewhere.
That's AfriForum CEO Callie Creel speaking on Saturday. Alongside Creel was Philip Buys, who chairs the Solidarity Trade Union, a group that says it represents 600,000 Afrikaner families.
We may disagree with the ANC, but we love the country. As in any community, there are individuals who wish to immigrate, but the repatriation of Afrikaners as refugees is not a solution for us. We want to build a future in South Africa.
Some said they appreciated Trump's gesture. Werner van Niekerk is a carpenter in Bothasig.
I think it's a very nice gesture from Donald Trump to offer us asylum over there.
He did not say whether he planned to take up the offer.
He didn't say if he was going to take up the offer, but it looks like they're all staying there. They're trying to rush over here to America to become oppressed by Donald Trump, because that's exactly what he would do.
Well, I think for many of them, though, you have to understand this, that the ending of apartheid did not mean the end of the wealth and the privileges that many white South Africans still have to this day. If you notice the home of that older man, he was living in a very nice home. And if you compare that with the living conditions of the majority of Black people in South Africa, those conditions are horrible. So we cannot be, we cannot let the smoke screen continue that says that just because apartheid ended, that exploitation and oppression ended for the great majority of Black people. The idea of the land redistribution is long overdue. Long overdue. We're talking about going from the 1990s to now 2024. Well, think about that. If you're talking about 2024, 2025, then, and you go back and say, well, when did apartheid end? And what are the conditions of the majority of Black people in South Africa? And they are the majority. And how white people are living there. Many of them saying, yeah, well, we had to give up some things, but we're doing very well. We don't want to go to the U.S. when things are going fine for us there. So you have to keep that in mind, too. But Trump, of course, is a hardcore nationalist, just as Elon Musk is a hardcore nationalist. But they understand full well that white supremacy is not completely eliminated from South African experiences. And so therefore, the Afrikaners know full well, and that's why there's not going to be a big rush to leave South Africa and come to the United States.
So Trump made the offer. The white South Africans refused, and so Trump should have cut off all the money. No money to you. But then the South African minister had a comment about that too.
And they said, let's not immobilize Africa. Let's withhold minerals to U.S. That is it. If they don't give us money, let's not give them minerals. But the reality, they take our minerals, but say why we're throwing funding. No, we have minerals in the continent, and therefore we have something that we have. We're not just beggars, but we must just use that endowment for our benefit as a continent.
We're not beggars. We have something that they want, minerals that we need and want in America. They said they'll hold that back. So was that the art of the deal that Donald Trump tried to broker?
Yeah, and see what you have to understand, the issue is it's not a matter of aid, it's a matter of trade.
Oh, no aid, no trade. Okay.
Right. Well, no, they don't want aid, they want trade. In other words, it's not a beggar if somebody asks for your aid, for your assistance. No, they want equitable trade relations. And so if you say you're not going to give certain funds and investment, then in turn, we'll think about trading with someone else. And currently, because of this shift, like I said, with Brooks and other kinds of movement going on, and particularly with the tariff move made by Trump, which has accelerated Chinese involvement in Africa, They're now looking at those options, not to mention with the current situation in the Ukraine and Russia, that Russia and China has upped their interest in trying to promote trade in Africa. And so, given that kind of balance of power, then the balance of power is shifting away from the dominance of U.S. imperialism to alternatives such as China, Russia, and other countries that are now looking to Africa as trade partners. Remember that Trump ended USAID. USAID is a program based upon giving aid to countries, and he's already disbanded USAID. And so you have to understand that the way South Africa and most of the continent of Africa are looking now is towards their own self-sufficiency and equitable trade relations.
And that's what Donald Trump is doing. I mean, with the tariffs, Canada, 25%, Mexico, 25%. You don't give me what I want, you don't get anything. And then Canada even commented about the whole issue of Donald Trump saying, we have everything here in America. We have energy. We have plenty of trees. We don't need Canada's trees. And then I heard the president of Canada say, well, Trump doesn't realize it, but the power to Trump Towers comes from Canada. We can cut you off, Trump. You didn't hear anything about that afterward.
Well, Trudeau, who's the head of Canada, has already began negotiations about joining the European Union.
Yes.
And that will be a major shift in terms of trade relations in response to the tariffs they're trying to impose on Canada. And the idea of annexation of Canada. See, it goes beyond just tariffs, but Trump has already said Canada should become the 51st state of the United States. Well, that's an insult. I mean, that's such an insult to even talk in those terms. So the Canadians recently booed in a sporting event that took place over this week, booed when they played the so-called national anthem and had the flag. So it's created hostility with regard to the United States. At the same time, this idea of nationalism and the nationalism that derives from white supremacy has also meant that other groups of people within the United States, and not just African Americans, are coming to realize what is involved around this whole idea of white Christian nationalism, which is one of the ideological instruments of Trump. And so, for example, just this week, federally funded Native American indigenous educational institutions, which most are, because they grew up out of the internment camps, so-called reservations. They established schools. One of those schools, which I know very well about because I lived there and actually visited, Haskell, which is a tribal college in Lawrence, Kansas, had to fire a number of its faculty because it's federally funded, and they took funds away from Haskell, one of the few of the tribal universities available. And so as a result, they fired the basketball coach in the middle of the basketball season. The coach of the women's basketball team was just dismissed 2 days ago in the middle of their season. And so that was because the funding had been reduced to an already underfunded institution. So we have to understand there's a need for us as African Americans to not narrowly look at this solely as an African American problem, but understand it in terms of the multinational character of this country and the class struggle that ensues for poor people, regardless of color. Because at the same time, Trump had just last week an executive order that went into play, and it hit places like Huntsville, Alabama. And here's what's interesting. In Huntsville, Alabama, as many states and cities and local areas have, they have what is called an energy assistance program. Now, energy assistance program, and I'm sure that many people in Dayton and throughout Ohio know about, provides for poor people who cannot afford to pay for their heating bills. What happens through those programs is that money is allocated to the various bank accounts of those people, which in turn then they immediately take that amount of money to pay for the bill. Well, Trump executive order ended that. And they sent notes to people this past week in Huntsville, Alabama, telling them that they no longer had the $100 that they've been receiving every month to pay for the heating bills. And now they had to come up with that $100 to pay this past month's heating bill. Without any warning, they just took the money out of their bank accounts. So now a lot of poor whites who thought that Trump was going to speak on their behalf are now saying that the draconian measures that he's taken has a class basis. And it's not just a question of white supremacy, it's a question of class rule and a move towards fascism.
So interesting. A lot of people during the election, we try to tell people what was going to happen. We try to talk about Project 25. People weren't listening. They were thinking, "Oh, that won't affect me because I'm white or I'm other or I'm Hispanic. It won't bother me. I'm Indian or Native American. Just maybe some black people." But look what he did. He's cut everybody, the government, everybody, VA hospitals, federal Social Security offices, and these organizations, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, just cut every. What are they going to do when everything starts to crash in like these planes are crashing? And I don't think that's just by accident or happenstance. I think a lot of this stuff is controlled. The price of eggs, chickens being infected. I mean, I think it's all done, controlled by Donald Trump and some of his organization members. I think it's Doge. I think it's all part of that. I mean, do you think I'm wrong for speculating that way?
I think what it represents, even beyond Trump, is what I call the crisis of the bourgeois state, the crisis of the capitalist state. And when we look at it, we go back and do an analysis of the past presidential election, we see the weaknesses and fractures within both parties. The Republican Party is fractured. In fact, I just saw this guy Steele, who used to be the head of the Republican Party committee, who's a black guy, who now is saying he's no longer a Republican, right?
Yeah.
And I've seen a number of people who are Democrats who are so frustrated with what happened in the elections that many of them are saying they're giving up on the Democratic Party. So what we see is a greater crisis within the bourgeois state itself. And what happens is that when Trump now enters into the scene, and this is why it's so important to understand fascism, in the period in which Germany found itself in a severe economic crisis, and this is where the United States is headed for, and these tariff initiatives and budget cuts and the elimination of key people in places that are vital, such as the FAA. And as you're going to see more near crashes and crashes taking place, and other vital areas in which then health, welfare, education becomes a critical issue, what you're going to see is a growing crisis within the society at large. What happens then is two possibilities: the possibility for fascism or the possibility for radical social change. So now what we have to understand is that we want that other option of radical social change. We have to begin to reconceptualize not only the current state of affairs, but the very history of this country, so that we have a better perspective on how to shape the future. So we don't resign and cry in resignation, but we stand up with resistance. And that's what becomes important. So I'm not one of those that when Harris lost the election, so woe was me, and feel so dejected because she wasn't really an option. She was a part of the problem. Both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party represent corporate interests. You don't get millions of dollars like she got to run a campaign of a person who didn't even run in the primaries without having connections with the ruling class. She spoke in terms of the ruling class. Trump speaks in terms of the ruling class, but he wants to push the boat towards fascism. So what we have to understand is that radical social change is the key issue, and we have to remember the words of Henry Highland Garnet: resistance, resistance, resistance.
Well, John, explain to me, number one, what for people that are listening that don't understand fascism, explain what that is, and where do you see our future in the next, let's say, 5 years?
Yeah, fascism is a stage in capitalist development where what takes place is the development of a state apparatus that becomes totalitarian and then no longer take the facade of being some form of democratic representation. That's very important to understand because you notice I said facade. It appears to be, in some ways, a democratic state, when in fact it's a matter of masking class hegemony, class rule, class dominance. But what Hitler did in Germany after Germany's defeat in World War I was to play up nationalism to identify groups of people who were said to be the cause of that failure in World War I, and generate then a mass movement behind consolidating control over the state. And this is what Trump is precisely doing. And so therefore, this control over the state requires an ideology of extreme nationalism, which is, in the case of the United States, coupled with white supremacy, because nationalism, the dominant national ideology, is white supremacy. And to then cultivate this kind of cultural perspective, as you find with white Christian nationalism, to support, without any critical assessment, the moves of the government to consolidate power and control. And so that's what he's trying to do now. And this is what I mean by fascism. So the facade is thrown away, and the open efforts to change the very foundation and structure of the state is in play. This is what he's trying to do now. And so what we have to begin to understand is that the way forward cannot be predicted. It's not a matter of a prognosis, it's a matter of a struggle. And if the struggle is successful, then you can overcome that. In Germany, they failed. In Italy, they failed. In Spain, they failed. But Spain went through a very serious civil war. And not only did a number of people leave the United States to fight in that war against Franco and fascism, but a number of African Americans were part of that. People like Langston Hughes and Paul Robeson both went to Spain during the Spanish Civil War. And Paul Robeson actually sung on the battlefields, supporting the Republican armies against fascism. Langston Hughes joined with people like Hemingway to report back from the battlefields to the United States. So we have to understand the international dimension of this and begin then to coalesce with other groups and the working class in particular to overcome fascism. So we can't make a prognosis like you do the weather and say there's a 50% chance of fascism or a 70%. No, it's all a matter of the balance of power. And so what we have to do is measure the balance of power and increase the power of struggle against the power of reaction.
When you teach on this program, John, I don't like to rush you. So can you stay a little longer than the
Oh,
scheduled time
sure.
you had? Okay, great.
Sure.
I wanted you to be able to do that because I understand when you said we cannot predict what could happen in the future, but have we gained enough strength from our history to be able to go forward, do you think, to resist some of this? When we hear about the programs for organizations, African Americans, other agencies being cut, when we hear that taking history out of our everyday language in school and education, no more highlighting of African Americans who stood out in American wars, and nothing that we did that really progressed us and progressed the country and that we created and invented is all being cut out. Even building the White House, they want to take that away too. I mean, have we learned enough to be able to fight and resist?
Well, I'd look at it like this, and I kind of look at it in a different way. I look at it in this sense, and that's when I was talking about the narrative. Remember, the narrative of African American history is United States history.
Yes.
I question that. If we say Ghanaian history is British history, if you were a Ghanaian, you would say, while British history has an influence, of course, through colonialism and oppression, Ghanaians are not British. We're Ghanaians. And so the way they were educated was to think that they were British. So they glorified the king. In fact, in all the colonial schools, they sang a song that glorified the royalty of the king and queen of England. But when Ghana became independent, they took on another attitude and perspective on who they were. And this is one of the things that Malcolm X said that I always thought was very profound. He says, we are not Americans, we are victims of Americanism. And I think that that's where we have to begin. So it's not about the contributions we make and leaving that out. It's about what we need to do in order to build our communities, to emphasize the significance of our self-determination against the onslaught. You see, contributionism presumes then that this is one nation, and I argue this has always been a multinational state. What is happening, as I mentioned, like at Haskell in Lawrence, Kansas, and what's happening to Native Americans, the indigenous population, is because they've never been considered a part of the, quote, nation. That's why the first census of the United States in 1790 excluded indigenous people and also excluded slaves. Slaves were not on the census of 1790. They were recorded in various bookings as property of slaveholders. Now think for a moment, if you're counting the population, who are the people who reside in this country, and you leave out African Americans and you leave out Native Americans, then what does that say about the history, the origins of this country with respect to the national identities of African American and indigenous Native Americans? So that's why I disagree with the idea that African American history is United States history. I say we are in the United States, but we've never been of the United States. And so being in it but not of it is one of the contradictions we find. This is why what you can look at, it's very interesting. If you look at all the wars the United States has had and what African Americans have participated in, it has always led after the war to a reaction against African Americans who served on behalf of the United States, and there's always been terror that follows those wars. After World War I, when the soldiers returned from World War I, they lynched soldiers in uniform. Think about that. When soldiers fought in the so-called Spanish-American War, mobs lynched soldiers in uniforms, and Theodore Roosevelt had the audacity to not stand up for soldiers who fought back against those people. And he, in fact, stripped them of their rights as soldiers, as veterans, because they fought back. And so the contradiction became, if I fight for this country and say I'm defending democracy, why can't I fight for myself and defend my people and my community? And so during World War II, you had a very interesting slogan. It was called the Double V campaign: victory in the war and victory in the United States. And so what happened was that people like A. Philip Randolph, for example, had proposed a march on Washington against the discrimination that was taking place in the federal government and in the armed services. Remember, when you talk about Tuskegee Airmen, that was a segregated outfit for aviation in the armed forces. They were not allowed to work with white people. Now think for a moment if Black people said, oh, well, then who are we fighting for? Well, we won't fight at all. It's not our war. Think about it. The Buffalo Soldiers said, well, why should I go about killing indigenous people when indigenous people and African Americans have the same plight? That's one of the contradictions you see of the contributionist approach, because we want to play up 5,000 Black people fought in the so-called revolution of 1776, when British and the Canadians offered freedom from slavery. Is that in our interest to fight on behalf of slavery? Because that's what George Washington was. He was a slaveholder. He led the troops, and he didn't even want Black people in the troops until the British began to overcome them, and people like Prince Hall, sent petitions asking to have us join them. What Trump did, I think it's very important for us, Trump is getting rid of all those Black people in the military. He just got rid of the Joint Chief of Staff person who was African American. I think that's a good thing. I think it's important now to understand that patriotism is reactionary because it doesn't serve our interests. So every time we come into a war situation and Black people go to war and die in those wars, whether it's Vietnam, whether it's the Civil War, whether it's the so-called Spanish-American War, World War I, Korea, you go on, we've always seen this reactionary response, because what happens is that Black people who fight in those wars really thought they were going to be given due consideration because of their contribution. And when they returned, the opposite happened. So at what point do we stop and think, wait a minute, how can we say we are a part of this country when they segregated us in troops, and then when we returned, they lynched us and they mobbed us? So we have to stop and think at some point and say, well, what is in our interest? And this is why I say we are an oppressed nationality. We have to develop an agenda for our own national interest. It is not the same as U.S. interest. Is our interest the same as Trump's interest in South Africa? We should be in solidarity with South Africa, not just diplomatically holding on to whatever the U.S. government says in terms of its policies.
Indeed. I see, and the thinking has to be different, John. And I think, I'm not going to say I'm too old to not think that, but I can remember thoughts back in slavery days. I heard people say when something happened, and they would say, slaves would say, oh yeah, boss, what we going to do, boss? What we going to do? It's like, it really didn't affect them, but we're so willing to jump in and volunteer and help. What we going to do? And that's the thought that all of us have. And sometimes I think about that myself. And I just think about that. What are we going to do as Americans in America? And we have ownership of this country. We have ownership of the Stars and Stripes. We have ownership of the Statue of Liberty and all the things that are American when we are really Africans in America. I got you.
Yeah.
I got you. And I hope people that are listening, I mean, and John's going to be here for a little while longer. If you have comments, I forgot to ask you to click in on the comment line, and you can have comments if you'd like. We'll be able to take your comments and questions as well. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, Malcolm X said, I think so graphically when he says about the field slave and the house slave. And the house slave said, when the master was sick, said, we sick.
We sick.
You're right. And when the field slave saw the master, he said, we're not on your side. If the house caught fire, they said, let it burn down. It's not in our interest. And so that's what we have to understand. We are so, and this is where this contributionism becomes dangerous, you see, because that whole view of Black History Month as a series of Black contributions that made this country what it is a narrative that doesn't take into account the difference between being in it and of it. So, yeah, slaves built the White House, but what does that mean? Did it end slavery? So why have pride in building the very thing that oppresses you? Soldiers fought in the 1776 Independence War, but what did it lead to? It led to a constitution that made fighting against slavery a criminal offense. Frederick Douglass was a federal criminal because he ran away from slavery. Harriet Tubman was a federal criminal because she ran away from slavery. Nat Turner was a federal criminal because he resisted slavery. So they broke the law. If the law is not in your interest, do you then continue on and say, well, we have to follow the law because we're law-abiding, whatever? No, we resist. And so that resistance becomes important because you have to understand what is in the interest of African Americans is not always in the interest of this country. In fact, most of the time, it's fundamentally the ruling class is a fundamental contradiction. So when the United States overthrows Kwame Nkrumah, or gets involved in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, and here's where the contradictions come up. You see, because people like Ralph Bunche, who served in the United Nations and served on behalf of U.S. imperialism, was always on the wrong side of the coin. But we glorify Ralph Bunche during Black History Month because, you know, he's one of the first Black people to earn a PhD in political science. He was one of the first to gain the Nobel Prize. But what did he get the Nobel Prize for? He got it for brokering Zionism and its dominance over the Palestinians. So he served the United States government, but he didn't serve the interests of oppressed and exploited people in the world. In fact, there was a guy who became the ambassador to Ghana. His name was Franklin Williams. He was the U.S. ambassador to Ghana that helped facilitate the overthrow of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. Now, here's the real deep part of it. Franklin Williams was an alum of Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. So was Dr. Nkrumah. And Nkrumah was excited by the fact that he could have a fellow alum from Lincoln become the ambassador to Ghana, and his job was to come to overthrow Nkrumah. But before he did that, he worked for the NAACP as a lawyer for the NAACP, and he was responsible for having to get rid of Harry T. Moore, who was the executive secretary of the NAACP in Florida. And the NAACP was upset with Harry T. Moore because he developed a different kind of chapters in Florida where the leadership was from the ground up rather than the top down. And so they stripped him of his position in Florida. And here's the sad outcome. As a result, Harry T. Moore continued to fight, and he was assassinated along with his wife Harriet around a case called the Groveland case in Groveland, Florida, which my sister's former husband is from. And they were assassinated on Christmas Day of 1951. And you can find very good documentaries on YouTube about Harry T. and Harriet Moore. Franklin Williams was a part of that same group that abandoned Harry T. Moore and was involved in the coup in Ghana. So how is he serving the interest? Why should we have him in a Black History Month celebration when Franklin Williams in the United States and in Ghana served the interests of the ruling class?
Amazing. It brings us to the point that we're going to talk about celebrating the independence of Ghana. I want to talk about that, and you can talk more about Nkrumah and some of the things that happen around that celebration. But I do want to let people know that you're coming to Dayton, Ohio on March the 6th, 7th, and 8th, and you'll be giving a presentation at the Clendon Institute of Learning here in Dayton, Ohio. And it's going to be amazing. People can come and celebrate and learn more about the independence of Ghana and how that happened. And before we begin to talk about that discussion, I want to also show this is a little clip on how Ghana's independence began.
The untold story of Ghana's independence, from colonial oppression to freedom fighters. Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African colony to gain independence from British colonial rule on March 6, 1957. The independence movement was led by Kwame Nkrumah, who became Ghana's first prime minister and later president. The country was originally named the Gold Coast by European colonizers due to its rich deposits of gold, but was renamed Ghana after gaining independence. The independence movement was marked by significant social and political upheaval, including strikes, protests, and violence. Ghana's independence was a major turning point in the struggle for decolonization across Africa, and inspired independence movements in other countries.
That's the short story. But every March the 6th at Independence Square, Ohio State University, around the country, a lot of people celebrate the independence of Ghana with parades. You know, like we celebrate 4th of July here, that's what they do in Ghana and around the country. People celebrate that. Why is that so important? 68 years since Ghana gained its independence, we still celebrate that. I think that's a lesson for us all.
Yes, and one of the things that I find remarkable is that Kaepernick, the ex-NFL football player, he decided on July the 4th not to stay in the United States and celebrate the 4th of July. He had read Frederick Douglass's speech about what does it mean for Black people to celebrate that. And he went to Ghana. And he went to Ghana, and you know what he did? He spent the whole time there digging into the ground to develop pipelines for running water. Remarkable. He spent like 2 weeks of doing hard labor with the Ghanaian people rather than sit here and celebrate something called the 4th of July. Remarkable, remarkable young man. On March 6, 1957, many people understood there were parallel movements taking place. Nkrumah had lived in the United States for a decade. He went to Lincoln University, as I mentioned earlier, which is a historically Black university. He lived in Harlem. He lived among Black people, and he made an association with both working class and intellectuals in the Black community. He worked with people like Dr. Du Bois. This is why ultimately Dr. Du Bois lived and is buried in Ghana. That's where he left the United States on the invitation of Dr. Du Bois, Dr. Nkrumah, to come to Ghana when he couldn't get any support for a project called the Encyclopedia Africana. When Ghana gained its independence in March 6, 1957, a host of Black people went to Ghana because in the parallel movement that was going on in terms of civil rights in the United States, people understood full well the significance of what Nkrumah was doing, and many of them personally knew him from the 10 years he spent here when he left in 1945. And so Nkrumah had worked with a number of groups, including the Council of African Affairs, which included Paul Robeson, Dr. Du Bois, and a very important man, Dr. Hutton, William Alpheus Hutton, who went with Du Bois to do the Encyclopedia Africana. Shirley Graham Du Bois, the wife of Dr. Du Bois, Nkrumah made the head of the Ghana TV establishment. The whole television network that was established initially was headed up by an African American. And African Americans formed a community in Ghana that included people like Maya Angelou. Malcolm X went to Ghana on several occasions, and one of the many African Americans who came to Ghana on March the 6th, 1957, was none other than Dr. Martin Luther King. And Dr. King and Du Bois met to discuss their parallel struggles and to exchange ideas on that. Later, Malcolm would come to Ghana on more than one occasion and meet directly with Nkrumah. In fact, when Nkrumah was in England as a student after leaving the United States, he wrote on behalf of African Americans a petition to the United Nations concerning the treatment of African Americans. I just found that just the other day in my research. And so Nkrumah had an abiding interest in African Americans and welcomed their presence there. And they were involved in various sectors of the life in Ghana, from education to technical development to artistic work, and like people like Maya Angelou, who was involved in the life of Ghana. So Nkrumah and the independence of Ghana was very significant. Let me share this because this is one of the ironies of the independence of Ghana. The head of state generally goes to such celebrations. In March of 1957, that would have been Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower refused to go. He wasn't going to go anywhere on Africa. He looked down on people of African descent. And many times he would refuse to meet with African leaders. So who got the job? His vice president, Richard Milhouse Nixon. So Nixon goes to Accra, the capital of Ghana, on behalf of the United States. That's just a diplomatic thing. You have to send somebody. And so when Nixon was coming off the plane, can you imagine hundreds and hundreds of people there on the ground yelling, "Freedom, freedom, freedom." And as Nixon got off the plane, he turned to one of these people and he says, "What does it mean to be free?" And this black man turned to him and says, "I don't know. I'm from Alabama." And so
I want to show the people the picture of Kwame Nkrumah. So in case they don't know what he looks like, I'm going to show that. And then we're going to come back and discuss some more. Okay, Kwame Nkrumah, and truly a remarkable man. many countries are there in South Africa? How many nations are there?
Oh, you mean how many nations there are on the continent of Africa?
Just
55.
How many?
55.
55.
Yeah,
And
the latest was Southern Sudan.
Okay, so 1957, Ghana became the first African nation to gain its independence. So at that point, none of the other ones were independent. They all were owned by their
the qualification is this: south of the Sahara. There were some independent African states north of the Sahara, but the importance of saying south of the Sahara is that the darker people of Africa are all south of the Sahara, where you have a greater Arab influence north of the Sahara. And so when Ghana gained its independence, that was why that was so significant, because that was the darker part of the continent of Africa. And Nkrumah had always identified with the whole continent, however, and the unity. So he was a Pan-Africanist, meaning all of Africa should be united and free. And so in his speech that he made at Ghana's independence, he made the statement, the independence of Ghana is meaningless until all of Africa is free. And so he committed resources of Ghana to that very project. So the very next year, in 1958, he did two things that was a follow-up on that statement. First, Guinea, led by Sékou Touré, was under French colonialism. When Guinea decided not to join the French community, the French decided to take every single part of the infrastructure in Guinea out of the country or to destroy it. And they literally did that. They even, what they couldn't take, they destroyed. They even took tea paper. Can you imagine? They took toilet paper from them rather than, so they couldn't even wipe you know what. Yes, that's how vicious the French were. Upon that action, Nkrumah was the first to say to Sékou Touré, don't worry, brother. And he sent several $millions in assistance to Guinea. And that became the basis of a long, relationship between the two. So even when Nkrumah was overthrown by the United States and Britain in February of 1966, where Nkrumah lived the rest of his life was in Guinea, Conakry, Guinea. The other thing that he did in 1958, he held what was called an All-African Peoples Conference in Accra, where he called together all the other countries that were still fighting for their independence to join together, not as heads of states, not as diplomats, but as people who were in the battlegrounds, on the ground fighters, freedom fighters, to come to Ghana to organize, consolidate, and network. Among that group was Patrice Lumumba, who later led the Congo to independence in 1960. There was also a guy by the name of Frantz Fanon, who later became known for his work on issues dealing with racism and his work as a psychologist and political ideologist who lived in Algeria. Also in that very group were members of various liberation movements who would then lead countries to their independence, like Mugabe in Zimbabwe, formerly Rhodesia. And so Nkrumah didn't make a slogan and speak words. He exercised his deeds on behalf of the African continent. And so when he wound up after the coup in Guinea, Sékou Touré actually declared that he would be co-president with Sékou Touré while he was in Guinea, a very remarkable thing to do. And if I may say, I hope that we get a lot of people to come out on March the 6th at the Clendon Institute for Learning, because I'm going to say more about Ghana. My book that'll be coming out soon is a book on Kwame Nkrumah's philosophy. I've studied that philosophy for 55 years, and I'm very excited about the book that's going to come out. And in my discussion at the McClendon Institute for Learning, I'm going to talk about how Dayton was a part of my understanding and comprehension of Nkrumah, because it all began in Dayton. And I'm going to talk about some of the key people in Dayton, like Mr. W.S. McIntosh, for example, and the House of Knowledge, his bookstore, and how it played a role in my learning, and how that is relevant to today, because what we have to understand, no government should dictate the education of a people. If you think you're going to be deprived of education because of what Donald Trump does or doesn't do, then I think you have to rethink your notion of education. Because education is an awareness of the world and our responsibilities in it. And if you don't have that, then no one can give it to you.
And it's not too late to learn. I'm learning a lot still myself every day. That's why I continue to do this program. The knowledge is just so fulfilling for me. And I just appreciate you coming and giving of your time and your energy and yourself to be on the show. The McClendon Institute is located on 3rd Street, West 3rd Street in Dayton, across from the old Roosevelt High School. I think it's an orange and black building. I pass by there almost every day. So I see the Institute there. And really, it's going to be starting on Thursday, March the 6th at 7 o'clock. That's when you'll give your discussion. Then on Friday, there's the Malcolm X program, popular music, culture, and arts. And then Saturday is the evolution of Malcolm X and his political philosophy, along with Dr. McClendon and Dr. Stephen Ferguson will be there as well. So he's been on my show as well. So it's going to be a great time. Come out, get some knowledge, learn a lot. It's really important. And I can't say this enough about Ghana's independence. After 58 years, Ghana is ruling itself. These are African men and women ruling Ghana. How are they doing today? I understand the economy is still great, a lot of resources in that country.
Well, Ghana has had its snacks after the coup, of course, because Nkrumah's vision and where he was headed, is why they had the coup, just like, the assassination of Patrice Lumumba and other countries. But what we see now is that a number of leaders, not only in Ghana, but throughout the continent, the message that Nkrumah laid forth is now being exercised in many other countries, like Burkina Faso. And so the young leader there is taking on many of the ideas that Nkrumah had there, and they're making a very good and progressive stance. In fact, he had some words for Donald Trump just very recently. Ibrahim Traore, who is a military guy who spoke out against the U.S. and Trump's policy, and throughout the French, because they were a French colony, out of Burkina Faso. And so that has created a whole storm around the revolutionary prospects. So Ghana and Nkrumah generated a perspective that wasn't limited to the time in which Nkrumah lived. It has created a legacy. So when we think about from March 1957 to March 2025, what we're looking at then is an extended legacy of leadership and vision and material results from the construction of a new society in the interest of African people. And this is what Dr. Nkrumah's vision was. And fortunately for me, and I'm going to talk about that more when we meet on March the 6th, is my own connection to Nkrumah. And I'm going to share with people a letter that a friend of mine wrote to Dr. Nkrumah about my work on behalf of Nkrumah and Nkrumahism in the United States that was sent to Dr. Nkrumah, which is one of my very happy moments that that letter was actually published. And I'm going to share that with people when we have the program. So I'm very proud of that. of 1971 from the campus of Central State University.
Decided was to kind of like.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
Our internet decided we're going to be on for just a minute. We have a comment.
Okay.
I'll say that with our internet starting to act up a little bit here. I don't know what the problem is, but it's going on. So we're still in the show. But Joyce Keith checked in and she said, John, again, a great show. Joyce said, a great show, John, and thank you for your insight. She apparently is learning a lot as well. So we thank you, Joyce, for checking in. As we get ready to close, I know that we talk about the price of many imported items coming into America. And I wonder if if they're in Ghana, would they have to come through the Gulf of America to get items to us here in America? Would they have to come through the Gulf of America the Gulf of Mexico? Okay, right. They come from Ghana, but they have to come that way, or is there a way around? Is there a way around?
See, what we have to understand, and this is where it becomes very important, is that not only is there a question of restructuring the narrative, but also restructuring the language that we use, because language has political implications and content. For example, referring to the United States as America is chauvinistic. Why? Because the idea that the United States is America negates the fact there's something called Latin America. It negates something called Central America, South America, and North America. To say the United States is America is chauvinistic. That's why I don't use the term American. I say the United States of America. And so that's a chauvinistic term. But it developed in the course of the expansion of the United States, where the arrogance and chauvinism and white supremacy became so dominant that they just said, well, we are American. But I don't use that term. And I've talked to many people from around the world who resent the fact, especially people from different parts of the Americas, that the United States calls itself America. So I don't use the term American. So the language we use, we have to be very careful of because it has political connotations.
Indeed, and I made that comment tongue in cheek because thinking about Ghana, their chief and largest export crop is cocoa. And I heard about the price of chocolate is going up. And you cannot have chocolate without having cocoa. And if Ghana's largest export is cocoa and America's want it, how will we get it here? I mean,
well, this is very interesting, you see, because when I saw that report about the price of cocoa going up, and then it made me think right back on Nkrumah. You see, at one time, Nkrumah and Ghana was the leading exporter of cocoa in the world. It no longer holds that position. I think now it's number 2. I think Ivory Coast may be number 1 now. I haven't looked at the recent figures, but during Nkrumah's time, it was the number 1 exporter of cocoa. In an attempt to lead to what was the coup in Ghana, they manipulated the world market and the price of cocoa. So the price of cocoa drastically plummeted during Nkrumah's time as the president of Ghana, with the express purpose of trying to overthrow Nkrumah. Unfortunately, what Nkrumah tried to call for was something like OPEC, what later developed with OPEC, where all the petroleum producing countries came together and they controlled the market rather than let outsiders control the market. And what he tried to argue for is that all the cocoa producers, if all the cocoa producers in Africa came together and they managed that, you couldn't have then the manipulation of the world market. But the division you see among African leaders didn't lead to that. So what happened was that the price of cocoa plummeted so vastly that it created then internal tensions where people were upset with the cost of living in Ghana And some blamed it on Nkrumah, but it wasn't Nkrumah's doing. And so the idea of monocrop dependency is a very significant part of imperialism. Now that we see this issue with the tariffs that Trump has initiated, I believe, and you're going to see, because I've heard some words said by certain leaders, including South Africa, is that there's going to be more effort to develop a continental currency rather than reliance on the dollar. And so the idea would be there would be an African currency rather than relying on the dollar as the foundation for their economies. Now, that will drastically change the whole position of the United States vis-a-vis Africa. And so that's one of the efforts that is currently underway. And Nkrumah tried to talk about that. And also the Libyan leader, Gaddafi, he also called for that. And that was one reason why the United States went after him, because he was willing to back it, because Libya had a very large gold deposit, so it could back its own currency. Now, you remember in the brief note that we got on Ghana, that one of the great exports of Ghana and minerals of Ghana is gold. It was called the Gold Coast. So there are a considerable number of gold deposits on the continent of Africa to create its own currency and not be dependent upon the dollar as the foundation for its currency, and on the International Monetary Fund and World Bank and USAID as a way of economic development. So that's in the making. So we may see higher cocoa prices coming with the response of the consolidation among African countries. What Nkrumah argued was it didn't make sense for them to export their cocoa and then import chocolate. So what Nkrumah always argued, why not then do our own processing of cocoa, develop our own chocolate, and then sell the chocolate, rather than send cocoa to Nestle's and all these other people and then have to pay 4 times of what they got for their raw cocoa in order to have chocolate. And so that was his vision.
Great point. I still like my chocolate. I know the price is going to go up. Yay, Ghana, if it does, maybe you'll make a lot more money. I don't know. We got to pay one way or another. John, it's been a great time with you this afternoon. Reminding people that the celebration takes place March the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th of March here in Dayton, Ohio at the Clendon Institute for Learning. John McClendon will be there, and also Dr. Stephen Ferguson will be there. You're invited. It's free, open to the public, and I know your sister Renee McClendon, who runs it, I know she's going to have something good for people to eat too. So be sure to come out and join them as well. Thank you, John, for joining us today.
Thank you. And I just want to add that part of that 3-day event, the reason why we're doing Malcolm X on Friday and Saturday as well is because this is the 100th anniversary of the birth of Malcolm X. So we're combining both the celebration of Ghana's independence with Malcolm X. And Malcolm and Nkrumah met together, and Malcolm says that the greatest leader of Africa was Dr. Nkrumah. So we're going to be talking about Malcolm X as well and his relationship to Dr. Nkrumah.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate you. And we'll be getting back with you, all these different stories that are coming up and with the issue with our country, the country that we live in, the country that we inhabit. So I'm going to learn how to change my language around that as well. Thank you so much. And thank your family for loaning you to us today. We'll see you around town. Thank you all so much for joining us here on Issues and Opinions. I'm Edna Parrish.
Thanks for tuning in to Straight Talk Live with renowned radio pioneer Edna Howell-Parrish, the program dedicated to presenting thought-provoking issues and opinions with the goal of challenging listeners to re-examine their assumptions and expand their opinions and give thought to new ideas and concepts to better their lives and the lives of others. Join us next week for another opportunity to participate in making the world better. So until next week, live your best life from your friends at Straight Talk Live and host Edna Howell-Parrish.